Hello everyone and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to talk about Deuteronomy chapter 20 in 5 minutes. We have quite a bit to talk about in this chapter, so let's jump right in. You can get this PDF and study it in more detail on our website. There's a link down in the description. When did the events of Deuteronomy chapter 20 take place? This is in approximately 1450 BC, right before the Israelite nation crosses the Jordan River and goes into the Promised Land. As far as our main characters, we have the Israelites, who we just talked about. They're that big nation. They are the descendants of Abraham. And we've also got Moses, who has led the Israelite nation out of Egypt into the wilderness. They've spent 40 years in the wilderness, and now he's finally led them to the borders of Canaan. And he is the one who's talking in this chapter. Our map is the final section on this page. We are still in Moab. Moses is doing his talking to the Israelites in Moab, probably near Mount Pisgah on the plains of Moab, which you can see in the top right corner of the map. As we look at our outline, this chapter has a lot to do with God's laws for the Israelites going to battle and some promises that he is going to give them as they go to battle against their enemies. So let's talk about the first section, verses 1 through 4. God promises to accompany Israel's army. So when Israel did battle with enemies who were superior to them in strength and in size, they were to trust that God was going to be with them and that he was going to give them the victory. Before the battle, one of the priests was to rally the army and to remind them that God was going to fight alongside them. He was going to accompany them, and therefore they had nothing to fear. Our next section, we talk about exceptions to military service. This is verses 5 through 9. So following the conquest of the Promised Land, Israelite men didn't have to serve in the army if they fell into one of 4 categories. And those categories included, number 1, men who had recently built a house and had yet to dedicate it. Number 2, men who recently planted a vineyard and had not eaten of the fruit of that vineyard yet. Number 3, men who were recently betrothed, kind of like being engaged. Number 4, men who were scared to go to war. Right? That's interesting. We'll talk about that more in our application section. Section number 3, we're going to talk about some terms of peace, verses 10 through 18. Now, before going to war with a city, the Israelites were supposed to offer terms of peace to the citizens within that city. If the citizens agreed, then the citizens would become servants of the Israelites. Now, if they refused the terms of peace, the Israelites were to besiege the city, the men were to be killed, but the women and the children were supposed to be kept alive. Now, this was to be the procedure after the Israelites conquered the Canaan land, or the Promised Land. These terms of peace were only to be offered to enemies outside of the Promised Land. The nations who inhabited the Promised Land were not to be offered terms of peace. So no person in the cities of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites were to be left alive. Their fate was a judgment that God was bringing upon them because of, quote, their abominable practices. And then the final 2 verses make up our 4th and final section, and that is rules about destroying trees. This is kind of an interesting passage. When the Israelites besieged a city, they were not allowed to destroy trees that were good for food. So maybe trees that produce like nuts or fruit. Only trees that didn't produce fruit were allowed to be cut down, and their wood used for siege works, to help in the besieging of the city. So don't cut down the fruit trees. And now finally, for our application, God doesn't need large numbers to win battles. It's interesting to me that God let all of the men who were afraid leave the army and not participate in the war, right? You don't hear of that much. He did the same thing, God did the same thing in the story of Gideon, which we read about in the book of Judges. When Gideon fought the Midianites, the fearful men all went home, and Gideon was left with only 300 men, but God used those 300 men to defeat thousands of Midianites. So bigger isn't always better. Sometimes bigger tempts us to put our confidence in ourselves, which would be to misplace it. God doesn't need a huge church. He doesn't need a huge budget to affect the world in the way that he wants to affect it. Jesus did it with how many men? Right? 12 good apostles. So it's better to have a small group of people, especially courageous people, people without fear, who are fully aware that their effectiveness comes from God, rather than to have a large group of people who believe that their numbers are what will ultimately make them effective.